and I've just been talking through metaphysics,
Yeah.
Gnosticism, and Christian humanism. Those have been the three things that we've really pounded in on, is that at the end of the day, whatever you want, whatever this thing is, whatever this beast is, it is trying to dehumanize the very nature of mankind. You know, whether it's
That's right.
Gnosticism, where it's metaphysics, bad metaphysics, evolution, all of this stuff is trying to dehumanize and bring on a new form of humanization to mankind. So we've just been working through that. And to be honest with you, David, it's kind of been, Jason's just been bringing me up to speed, kind of giving me a classical education that I never had. You know, and I've just been learning, you know, I'm in my 40s now, just turned 40 last year. And I've realized that I just didn't know how the world worked. You know? Yeah.
Well, joining the club, I was about 60. So, you know, you got a 20-year advance start on me.
When you turn 60? Just 2 days ago?
But no, I'm actually 64 this year.
Good, man.
Well, thank you very much. It's amazing what you know, camera filters can do and long distance viewing. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of spooky to me. You don't even look like a white guy, Knox. I mean,
I try my best.
I don't know what kind of filter you got on, but it's really incredible. But
well, you know.
Anyway, no, and you know, now I'm sure Shannon can go way beyond in some of these things than I can, because my focus has been in the sphere of law, government, and politics. And in fact, the law is reconstructing us as human beings. And we have to appreciate that, and we'll get into that today. And you know, I'll tell you, there's a verse of scripture that came home to me as recently as probably early December. So this is what, 3-4 months ago. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is talking about no foundation, he says, can be laid other than that which is laid in Jesus Christ. And then he says, now we're going to build on that foundation. You're going to build with hay or straw or gold or silver. And I used to think of that verse this way, and maybe Shannon, this is Gnosticism too, but I thought, if Christ is the foundation of my salvation, you know, he's the mediator between God and man, and without Jesus Christ, there is no salvation. So he's the foundation. So I looked at it soteriology, in terms of soteriology, not cosmologically.
Right.
That Christ is the foundation of all things, because he is the firstborn of all creation. He is begotten of a generative God. In him is the form and the archetype of all that will thereafter exist. And to limit who Christ is and the revelation that we have of him as the only begotten Son of the Father, the second person of the Trinity, and what is implied in the incarnation, the resurrection, and the ascension and his glorification, we limit who Christ is, and we really wind up, I think, in a subjective theology that's focused on the me in a very existential way. We don't start with the objective knowledge of God and then allow the objective knowledge of God to interpret our subjective existential experience and moment. Does that make sense, Shannon, what I'm saying?
Yeah. You know, we've been, this is kind of part of why I think this is an important conversation. So I by nature, growing up as a charismatic, I was probably a theonomist and never knew it. But because of,
we all are and don't know it.
Yeah, I tell Jason that all the time. Like, Jason,
he's been trying to make me into a theonomist.
Yeah, I'm trying to. He when he talks, he is. It's just natural for him to do that. But what I've always rejected how people view and this is because I think they have a bad view of a natural law.
Yeah.
But I think the way that I'm starting to understand common law and natural law, I think I have a place for it now. The way that I think the way that I'm viewing it under a theonomic worldview. So, general revelation, we've kind of in the evangelical world have poo-pooed on a little bit, and because we give general revelation to the world instead of saying like, no, actually, this is one of God's books to you of who He is.
That's right.
And so,
that's right.
But the way that people have interpreted natural law and common law have been the reason why we rejected it, not because of the fact of what it is. Now, when you truly understand what it is, you're like, oh my goodness, this is everything I believe is a theonomist, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's everything that I believe too, as a Christian that sees God winning throughout time and space, right? And seeing the beautiful unraveling of revealing of God's plan through history, where man is maturing up into this place. And so, part of when I was going through your book, The Naked Court, one of the things that struck me, and I think we start here, David, and then we can go back and get to where we are. And Jason, anytime you want to, but I thought this was a great place to start. So I was on Jason Whitlock, and we were talking about the Penn State men swimmers swimming for the girls team. And everybody is up in arms about this right now because their girls are having to swim against a guy, and this guy is inside of the girls' locker room just letting it all hang out, right? And nobody wants to say on the team how bad this is, but everybody can see it. Right. He's breaking records by 45 seconds, and he's just pummeling the girls. But when I was reading Inside the Naked Court, one of the things you said in there was that, hey, if you were paying attention to what happened in Obergefell, then this is the sports. It's nothing new. It's going to roll out because of the fact that it allows them inside of the Obergefell standing to be able to identify however they want to identify. So we've given them a precedent inside of that Obergefell that no one knew we were doing. I think I heard one lawyer say, people keep asking me, it was Jeff Schaefer. He said, people keep asking me, when are we going to hit the bottom? Because it just keeps going down. He said, we've hit the bottom. When the Obergefell happened, that was the absolute bottom. Everything now is only mushrooming out. We're only going out from here. The bottom has hit.
That's right.
So, David, how do we get to a place where, because from what I understand, common law would have never allowed for something like this to happen?
No.
So how do we get to a place where no one knows what common law is, and we have boys on a swim team for girls? Because I think having the practical reality of that right there and tracing it all the way back to what it used to be and what it was and how we lost it is really helpful to get to see where it's practical.
Yeah. Let me answer that question by making perhaps a couple of statements. Can you hear me okay? I don't want to feel like I'm yelling. Okay. There are a number of things that have contributed to biological males swimming against girls and going around exposing their male genitalia to women in the locker room. There are a number of things that have contributed to it. And so we can only focus today, on the specific topic that we have. Where are we in American law, and how did American law get here specifically? But ultimately, going back to what we were talking about, one of the things that I've realized is that in large part we're here because of Christianity. Because Christianity, in my experience, now I was raised in the church from the nursery up, sitting on the front row in what would be called today conservative, Bible-believing evangelical churches. Now, when I say that, I wasn't just raised in one faith tradition like a Baptist. I was in Baptist church a long time. I was in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church for a long time. I met my wife in a Methodist church. I was kind of moving around, so to speak, with my parents. I was in an instrumental Christian church, not the non-instrumental Church of Christ. And I've been in Presbyterian churches since about 1990, I guess 91. But you don't hear much objective theology preached from pulpits. What I mean by that is that all of our doing must follow our knowing. And to know God is eternal life. It is to know life. Without the objective knowledge of who objectively God is, we will not interpret our existence correctly. That's the sort of the point of why I started out with that verse. So how often do we hear really explicated to us the doctrine of the Trinity and why it is a practical doctrine fundamental to all things and the foundation for all things? How often do we hear that? I never heard it. And I'm in a really solid church right now, but it's not taught that way. The sermons preached in our church today are really fine, but you have to sort of pick it up in the bits and pieces and think, oh, I see how this week fit with last week and the week before, and then all of a sudden 3 weeks later another piece comes in. It's not taught in a systematic sort of way. And how often do we talk about creation? I mean, when you really think about it, since Darwin in 1859, and then particularly, let me turn this phone off. And when you think particularly after the Scopes trial, Christians have been embarrassed by the doctrine of creation. We will espouse it and we will confess it, but we don't understand it and we're embarrassed by it and we leave it inside the church walls. Now, why that is so important, and going now to your question of the common law. The common law is rooted in a natural law, and we'll talk a little bit about natural law because there are different concepts of natural law today.
Yeah.
So sometimes when you see somebody talk about natural law, don't assume they're talking about what you are anymore. And Shirley MacLaine and I are both talking about God.
Yeah.
You know, it's a whole different concept. But then that natural law was rooted in the existence of a creator who established law pertaining to the very nature of all things for the purpose of bringing glory to himself. And so, as I said in the book, you know, there's a law of rockness. You know, rocks are great for building walls and using to create aggregate for concrete and all that, but they're not very good to eat. They'll provide no nourishment. It's outside the law of its nature, right? As I said in the book, trying to be simple, there's a reason we say you can't get blood out of a turnip. Okay, it's not there, but it'd be good to eat. It may not build a very good wall. Okay, and the same is true with us as human beings. And when we lose this doctrine of creation, we lose the foundation of everything, including law. So as you can see, just in what I've said then, if common law is rooted in a natural law that's rooted in the fact there's a transcendent God who has established a law pertaining to not only the existence of all things, but the relationship of all those things to the other things, so that they fit in an organic unity, but yet with a beautiful diversity and distinctiveness of being in existence, so to speak. When you lose that, well, all of a sudden you can't have common law. So when Christians sort of became afraid of the doctrine of creation, would not challenge the metaphysics, let's say, of materialism, which cannot explain anything. Now, you can have all kinds of what do we call it? Integral steps, you know, showing perhaps some form of microevolution. But if all there is really matter, then how do you explain motion? How did matter come into motion? And how did either a single element of matter, a single atom, let's say, or or energy, how did it ever become a diversity? How did lots of bits of atomistic matter ever come together to actually form a tree? Who provided that sense of motion and unity to those things? They can't answer any of that. Now they'll huff and puff and they'll blow their house down and just picture the Wizard of Oz with all of his smoke and his mirrors and his all that. But back behind it is puny little man who says, I have no idea in whom we live and move and have our being. We won't say, well, I know you don't like mine. It's a myth. That's what Canada just said today, right? You can't provide counseling on this. And say, I don't like myths either. But I particularly don't like yours.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to me how matter became either got into motion, how matter became diverse, how matter became unified, and tell me how matter became metaphysics. How from matter do we get concepts of beauty and justice? How do these metaphysical things come from pure physical things? There's a great story by, I think his name's John Lennox. Does that name ring a bell to y'all? I don't want to misstate who he is, but he's a.
That's John Lennox.
I think it's John.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Or Annie Lennox.
John Lennox is, I think it's his name, but he teaches math, or did, at Oxford.
Oh yeah.
And he was telling the story. Yeah, that they had these faculty dinners, and so he and his wife were sitting next to this guy in the chemistry department, and his wife, and so they started to talk and ask what each other did, and Lennox said, "Well, I do mathematics. I'm very interested in the metaphysical and theology." And the scientist said, "Well, we got nothing in common." He said, "Well, no, I think we do." He said, "How?" And Lennox said, "Well, let's look at the menu here. You believe everything is explainable in terms of pure matter, right? Yeah. And so this menu, explain this menu to me strictly in terms of ink and paper." And the guy, he said, because right here it says chicken, salad, vegetable, dessert, beverage.
Right.
Explain this paper to me strictly in terms of its material properties. And the guy said, and Lennox said, his wife looked at him and said, "Get out of that one, I dare you." But see, he realized, I can't explain this thing that goes beyond the mere matter. And that's what Paul was doing on Mars Hill. We don't do that. As our friend you've already alluded to, Jeff Schaefer, says, we accept the constraints of a godless humanism and think we can prevail and reform or change anything by arguing within the limits that they give us. And that is impossible. It will not happen.
Go ahead. So you've been a Christian a lot longer than I have, but in your experience, this is a problem that goes all the way into the pulpit. Even in the pulpits, you don't get.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You don't get it. Yeah. And see, there's a billboard. I just wrote a commentary about it. There's a big billboard coming into town that says, Jesus provides freedom. Jesus provides freedom, and it says addiction, fear, and something else.
Right.
Now, that is a true statement. But what you need to say first is, Jesus provides freedom from the dominion of sin and the law of sin and death. That's where all these other bondages come from. You're talking about Jesus as an instrumentality to your better life now, and you have no objective theology, and the people in the pews aren't interested in it, so pastors don't give it to them. Now, I'm not talking about all pastors. But that leaves us then vulnerable to live in the world.
So there's almost existentialism that has grown out of the materialism, and instead of saying, "Hey, we should pull up the roots of this problem," we just feed the existentialism with a little bit of Jesus-stentialism.
All right, before y'all get too deep, explain existentialism and explain that and say that differently for me.
Okay. Well, existentialism is a metaphysical claim that meaning can still be found within the experience of an individual, even if the universe itself is meaningless.
Okay.
So that we can live in a meaningless universe that's pure matter and energy, and that where nothing has a nature in and of itself, so there's no proper use of anything within the world.
But I can still
But
find
I
meaning.
can find meaning within my experience by my choices and actions.
So is it just saying the stuff that I made up is absolutely nothing and means nothing and is nothing, but somehow I can find some sort of meaning from nothing? But then I can make that meaning. Is
that
you make the meaning?
Me,
yeah.
But
then that doesn't apply to anything in the world.
Yeah, right. It doesn't.
Your meaning doesn't apply to anything in the world whatsoever.
There's no external meaning. There's no objective meaning. But there can still be subjective, experiential meaning.
So the problem with common law then is that it anchors.
It's anchored in
the meaning into the reality,
into an objective reality, a created order. And we have disconnected it. So, for instance,
thank you, David.
I have a couple of quotes here from you that I think will help you understand what's happened to the law and how what I'm about to say is incompatible with a common law grounded in a natural law that's grounded in a creator who has established a law relative to all things and the relationship of all things to each other. So an organic whole.
Did you say that's incompatible with reality then? Because that's
our view of reality. Now, Molly Cyrus would say, live your own truth, right? There is no objective out there reality. So the only reality I can have is what I create for myself. Now, hear how the Supreme Court has put this in the law. Now, this is from 1992. This is a quote from Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the case that in 1992 reaffirmed, quote, the central premise of Roe versus Wade, which was 1973. Now, this is the case, Roe and Planned Parenthood, that are now in front of the Supreme Court. It was argued last December in a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Yeah. So here's what the Supreme Court said that you and I would say this needs to be attacked. But listen to what it's saying about the law and the human person and the relationship of the human person to anything. Quote, our obligation is to define the liberty of all, not to mandate our own moral code. Now, there's an element of truth to that you and I would say, you're right, the court cannot mandate its own moral code because there already is one. Mm-hmm. But the question is, how do they understand liberty? Now, this is what we were talking about in the other podcast, that what is liberty? What is my individual liberty? What is civil liberty? Because we have different aspects of liberty, okay? A natural liberty and a civil liberty, which are different. But then the court in that same case went on to say this: choices central to personal dignity and autonomy are central to the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. Now, for your listeners, let me just explain. The 14th Amendment, adopted after the Civil War, it was one of the 3 Civil War amendments, says that no state can deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, so before I can deprive Shannon of liberty, I have to show that there's some law that describes some wrong or some duty that's the breach of which is a wrong. And then I have to show by a due process, a fair process, that he actually committed that wrong. And then I can take away his liberty or fine him or apply the death penalty. But if there's not declared to be a duty, the violation of which results in some kind of sanction, then I can't touch him. Okay, so there's that word liberty. Now, we need to appreciate that liberty was understood at common law as the ability to move around without prior restraint. It was called locomotion. I can get up and
Mm.
go down the street and visit my neighbor, and I don't have to get a permit to do it.
This is what we were talking
Now, see,
about.
martial law would be the opposite of that.
What's
See,
happening in Canada right now?
Yeah.
yeah, what's happening in Canada? What's been happening in a lot of our
Yeah,
cities
that's right.
is my ability to move around. I want to go to a restaurant. I can go to a restaurant. I don't have to get a permit to go to a restaurant, right? So now let's read that sentence again. Choices central to personal dignity and autonomy are central to the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. Well, I hate to say it, the 14th Amendment right to locomotion and move around really was not dignity and autonomy. So while I had the liberty to move around, I couldn't just say, hey, Knox, I really like your house, and it's got a swimming pool in the backyard, and I think I'm just going to move in. I hope y'all don't mind. I'll just take the back bedroom. You'd say, no, that's a trespass,
That's
right? You don't have that kind of liberty. You don't have that kind of autonomy. And then the court said this is fundamentally, this is the worldview of the court in the law. This is from 1992 at the heart of liberty. Now we're going to get, okay, liberty somehow is tied up into my dignity and autonomy. But he says, but really at the heart of it is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life.
That's
what liberty is.
Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, 1992. That's the justification for continuing Roe versus Wade.
I haven't read that before.
I
thought
either.
I'd read all of the.
Yeah. And it says beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood. Okay. Why is that word important? Because the 14th Amendment applies to persons.
Mm-hmm.
So being a person is a liberty to define the mystery of life, the meaning of the universe, of meaning and of existence, and so those things cannot be formed under compulsion of the state. Now, there's an element of that that's true too, but that doesn't mean that there is no given, defined concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. It comes from God. But when you've eliminated God from the equation, where else can it come from?
Well, they just made themselves God, though, because
that's right.
Individuals able to define those things, and then they're saying the court doesn't have any jurisdiction over the definitions of that individual.
But somebody has to provide that metaphysical transcendent meaning.
I mean, all you have left is the coercive power of the state to define it.
That's right. All you have left. Now here's so that's 1992. Now let us move to 2015.
What were you going to say?
With the decision in Obergefell.
Before you go to Obergefell.
Before you go to Obergefell, that is a return to Roman imperialism in terms of a metaphysic, right? You can have your religion so long as it doesn't, you can do whatever you want so long as it doesn't keep you from coming over and dropping your pinch of incense to the Caesar, right? That there's an overarching religion, imperialism, and everything else is fine so long as it stays in place, stays in your head, stays in the where but that's a and
doesn't interfere with anybody else's claim to be an autonomous self defining their own world,
except for you.
Now
in the womb.
Now that works pretty well, as long as we're atomistic monads who never bump into each other.
Right.
Okay. But the problem is we bump into each other,
which is a whole civil law.
That's right. So now here, let's bring that forward. That's 1992. Okay. Let's bring it forward to the very first sentence in Obergefell. And if y'all see the value of this sentence, you will be in the top 98 percentile of Christianity. I think that's the way you'd say it, right? There'd been only 2% who would you'd be with. We don't get it. We don't see its importance, or we see it and we say, nah, that's never going to go anywhere. That's so stupid, it couldn't go anywhere. Well, here's the first sentence. This is the "in the beginning God" verse of law today that was the predicate for saying male and female have no objective given realities and are interchangeable. Marriage is therefore a convention of man created by man in order to assure that we don't go through life lonely and have companionship. Now that's exactly what the court said. That's what marriage corresponds to. But how did they get there? The first sentence. The Constitution promises liberty. There's that word again, right? They're all rooting it in the 14th Amendment and the word liberty, which under the common law would have been the ability to move around. You want to go over, Bob, you want to go over to Fred's house? Yeah. Okay, go. And, if y'all have sex in there, I don't know. So just keep it to yourself. That's fine. May not be good, but I don't know. It doesn't affect the public that we know of. So they're taking this word that the common law would have said locomotion and see, they've already contorted it. Liberty is now defining my meaning, my existence, the universe, and my dignity. And they said, so the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons, we'll break this down in just a moment, within a lawful realm to define and express their identity.
So you can have a religion so long as it's a Gnostic one. That's what they're saying. Because at this point, as Christians, we say, no, that's not reality. You're not talking reality anymore.
Yeah.
Right. That
you're not.
Has a specific nature that we either conform to and live, or we don't conform to and die. That's
right. But see, that depends upon having a doctrine of creation, right, which we don't talk about. I mean, we might recite the apostle, I believe in God, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and that's as far as it goes. We read the first 2 chapters of Genesis strictly because you have to get to them to get to chapter 3, verse 15, where soteriology kicks in. I'm not interested in cosmology. I'm not interested in anything objective. I just want to know, what do I do about me? I got problems with depression and fear and alcoholism and all this stuff. Who's going to save me? So hear what the Supreme Court is saying now. It says that it includes certain specific rights. Now, they don't say what they are yet, although in this case, they are a right to get a marriage license from the state. Now, what's interesting there is you have a liberty to force the government to take an action. That's not typically what liberty was understood as the common law. It was not to force the government to act. It was for me to act. So the question then becomes, if you want to carry this out and begin to look at it, so if I have a liberty that includes rights, and part of that liberty is to compel the government to act, then how can I have a right to abortion if the government doesn't help fund it?
Right.
So now can I, and Clarence Thomas brought that up in his dissenting opinion, that liberty it's been understood as a liberty from government, not a liberty to compel an action of government or a liberty to compel a benefit from government.
Okay, David, okay, there's 2 things.
It's going to get worse, but you can go ahead. We'll come back to it.
Okay, don't forget where you're at, because this is really helpful. A couple things. When you were talking about manhood and womanhood, they blew up manhood and womanhood in Obergefell. Blew it absolutely up.
That's right.
Which means something clicked for me when you said that. If they've blown up manhood and womanhood, then they blew up the nuclear family.
That's right.
And they blew up kids and who the kids belong to.
That's right.
Which is why parents in Loudoun County and other places across the country are having a hard time communicating to the people who serve them in their government schools who the kids belong to.
That's right.
You just put that together for me. So I've always known with government education that there's been problems there. But what happened with Obergefell, it actually exposed it even more so, because now there is no connection between mom, dad, kids. The kids, in one sense or another, can belong to the government.
Yeah, I want to come back and talk about that in just a moment, because this will really freak you out, because what you just said goes back to the Supreme Court case from 1925, where we had already blown it up.
Well, but even,
I'm going to trace this for you.
The fact that you have to get a license to get married in the first place means that your marriage already belonged to them.
That's right.
If you had to ask for permission to get married,
then you don't have a right.
Liberty.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's right. Now now, Shannon, that's actually the marriage bill that we have in virtually every state except for about 6. Unless you get a permit from the government, you can't marry. What that means is, and what I'm trying to help Christians understand, and it goes over their head, their eyes glaze over, is I said, this is the claim by man, by law, to have absolute, total jurisdictional authority over what God has created and who he gave it to. This is the same problem that Nebuchadnezzar had and that Herod had, of thinking somehow they're godlike.
Is that why we have a president that acts like a donkey?
Well, I'm not sure that acting like an elephant's much better, but
yes, agreed.
Facts.
I mean, look, shades of godlessness is godless.
That's right.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
Yeah. So, but do you see what's happened here? Is that we've said government owns marriage. Now, the fact that in the past it said that only a man and a woman could get married, and ministers could solemnize them so that they were given legal recognition. Here is the point. In Tennessee and in most states today, you not only have to get your fiance's permission to marry, and that of perhaps their parents if you're chivalrous, but you have to get the government's permission. You go get married in the state of Tennessee, or I'm sure even in the state of Idaho there, if you didn't invite the government to the wedding and get their permission, then what you do in front of your minister is irrelevant. The state will not recognize your promise, no matter how sincere, no matter how greatly witnessed, no matter how solemnly you were charged. They will say that was a nullity in the eyes of the government.
And in Tennessee, add to that if you're going to be a minister who performs wedding, you have to go get the government's permission to even perform weddings. Right? So,
you have to. Well, the law says who can perform them.
Right. I was a minister from California and flew in to perform a wedding, and I wasn't allowed to sign a Tennessee because I had not filed as a minister with the Tennessee government, and then received my permission to do weddings.
That's right.
So we had to have an uncle of the bride, I think, come in and actually sign, even though I had done the wedding, which, who knows, maybe that was illegal too.
Sure. Well, you could have done the wedding and then said, now, for the law to care, for you to actually get Social Security benefits or something else, you need to go find a county commissioner who can sign the paperwork.
Okay.
Now, okay. So we're getting off. I want to come back to what you just said about exploding the family.
Yeah.
But I want to finish this sentence with Obergefell. So we've talked about, we've got liberty, which is a liberty of autonomy to define all of reality. Now, as Shannon was saying, that's very important when there is no God that gives reality or meaning, because the world is meaningless. I have to create my own meaning. If I can't create my own meaning, then my life is meaningless. That's where my dignity comes in, and therefore I have to have autonomy. That autonomy is the legal word liberty, and then it says within a lawful realm to define and express their identity. Now, that's the word that people will look at and say, oh, well, thank God there's a limit to that, right? There's a lawful realm. And I'd say, yeah, but who controls the lawful realm?
Right,
that goes back to what Dave was saying. Shannon was saying about imperialism. The Supreme Court will decide the lawful realm.
You've just established an existential metaphysic as the official government religion.
That's right. The Supreme Court has become God. That's why I said in my book, The Naked Court, it is damnable in God's sight.
Yeah.
They have claimed a jurisdiction by which to control for all persons their ability to define and express their identity. And the one identity you cannot define and express, at least in relation to other people, is a Christian identity. I don't want a man undressing in front of my wife and daughter in the locker room. Well, that's not an identity you can have, David.
Mm. Right.
Yours is outside the lawful realm.
Because ours has a different metaphysic. Ours is challenging the godhood of the state by saying,
yeah,
well, actually, there's a God above you.
That's right. Now let me show you how this works out, and then I want to come back, Dave, to your statement about the family. In the Dobbs oral argument, and I've talked with our mutual friend Jeff Schaefer about this a lot, no one even, as he said, mused aloud as to whether the unborn were persons who might be entitled to equal protection or due process.
Yeah.
There was no discussion of what it meant to be a person. Now, what I would call probably the leading, at least in my view, the leading Christian legal organization in the country, on their website, talked about the fact they supported the Mississippi law, which prevents abortions after 15 weeks. Now, the fact of the matter is, most abortions occur prior to 15 weeks. But 15 weeks was chosen because clearly the human being is not viable at that point. If you extract it from the womb, it'll die. I mean, science can't even keep it alive, okay? So they picked 15 weeks, and that's fine, in order to challenge the court's concept that the state has absolutely no interest in anthropological truths prior to viability outside the womb.
Mm.
There is no such thing as a human or a person until at least medical science can keep that thing alive. Now, so that's why Mississippi picked it. Now, this leading legal organization said, we support the law. Now, I'm quoting almost verbatim here, because at 15 weeks, the unborn, and they probably use the word child, the unborn person, can suck their thumb, moves around, can feel pain, and there are a few other particular sort of things that seem humanish, okay? Now, what is going on there? This is what Jeff Schaefer and I were talking about. We are saying, because you can suck your thumb and move around and feel pain, those facts should be interpreted to have some value or meaning. But why? What gives those facts any meaning?
Mm-hmm.
And if it was prior to moving and sucking and feeling pain, would you concede it's okay then to kill that person? Well, you would think that Christian organization would say no, but see, it was unable to offer or willing or felt it could give in light of our modern humanistic liberty is my own autonomy to define the universe. If I'm going to operate within that system, I got to give some kind of facts that might indicate that there's another autonomous thing here that gives it some meaning and value. I can't just assert that because it is distinct from the mother in every regard except for its nutrition, its own DNA structure, its own life, and so on and so forth, I can't assert that that's a person. So I'll just give you a bunch of disparate facts and hope you will draw the same conclusion I will. But the abortionist says, well, why should sucking a thumb and moving around and feeling pain for that be more important than me feeling pain of losing my job or not finishing my education or losing my boyfriend or going on the poor line because I can't afford another child?
They're counting on sentiment.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
So at that point, then, whoever has the best emotional, subjective argument wins the day.
Well, now, again, as my friend Jeff Schaefer said, don't think that the court doesn't realize the gravity of what's at issue here. I mean, nobody denies that that's a human life prior to 15 weeks. Nobody. And the gravity of it is, can an individual unilaterally decide to take the life of another human being? That's what abortion is. They understand the gravity of it, but nobody's willing to talk about it. It's the elephant in the room, and we're not allowed to talk about it because that will sort of bring in God and realities that we just don't want to think exist.
So, David, we've drifted so far from common. This wouldn't even be a question in common law, would it?
No. Now, see, let me mention right here. See, common law would have said there are things that are essential and things that are in themselves non-essential. Okay, so for example, if you look in, I think it's chapter 6 of my book, when it came to marriage, what was essential to marriage was you had a man and a woman, and they made a certain kind of promise to one another. Okay, so I wasn't saying, sweetie, I really love you. Could I lease your body for the next 10 years until, things start to change a little bit here? And I'll pay you some money every year for that. No, it wasn't the lease agreement. I'd like to buy you for the next 10 years. No, it wasn't that. It was a promise of fidelity and commitment and covenantal bond to that person in all regards and in all relationships. That's what made it, the law say, that's a marital contract. You weren't just leasing her or buying her or renting her or she renting you. This forms a kind of thing we call a marital contract. Okay? And so you had to have a man and a woman, and you had to have a certain kind of promise. That made a marriage. Now, the judges in England had said, well, we have to figure out what to do with property. And that's really why we have marriage licenses to begin with, is to help prove, was I living in sin? Was I just copulating over here? Or was this actually my wife? Is there any legal relationship? Are our children bastard children's? Or are they heirs? Where we go with property. So we need to be able to prove that we're married, really for property purposes. But the common law said, well, it would just be easier for the social order if all the property of the woman was unified in the man. Okay? And so we had this doctrine called coverture, that the woman didn't own any property and the man owned all the property. Now, that was for convenience sake. And Blackstone, who was the great commentator that the American founders looked at, said this is one of those things to which the law could be indifferent. It doesn't have, the titles of property doesn't have to be this way, but at the moment we think this promotes the social order because the title's all unified in one person. Okay. Later, Parliament came along and said, we're going to abolish this doctrine of coverture. Women can own property in their own names. Now, what happened in Obergefell is Obergefell said that the abolition of coverture, which the common law said was not essential to a marriage. In other words, the way that you hold title doesn't make you married. I mean, if you and I went out and owned a joint piece of property, nobody say, oh, I guess y'all must be married. Y'all jointly own this piece of property. We say, no, man, we're not married, right? The Supreme Court said because they abolished coverture and the way title was held, that was a substantial change in the structure of marriage. And because marriage is constantly evolving and changing, see, there is no given being or fixity to anything. Well, now marriage has to change too. The common law jurist would have looked at them and said, are you stupid? The way we hold title isn't an essential element of marriage. It's a thing to facilitate the carrying out of the marriage. But we could have put up the title all in the name of the woman, and that wouldn't have changed the nature of the promise or the parties that are there. But the Supreme Court took what the common law would have said, this is a thing to which the law can be indifferent. But the law could never be indifferent to whether you're male or female.
Because the
The law
definition
could
of male and female
is a given
is a given. It's
from creation.
it's a natural law given.
Yeah. And see, Obergefell says it's not.
This feels criminal, David.
Yes.
This feels
And the church is asleep. I hate to say it. I've been talking about this to national legal organizations, national Christian political organizations, denominational leaders, and they don't understand what an offense this must be to God.
Right.
And somehow God is not going to correct the situation. That's the point of my book. God will bring his wrath down on that nation whose highest tribunal says this is what it means to be human, and we are now the creators of reality and decide the lawful boundaries of your autonomy and ability to create the universe. And when a church does not say something, it's in the position like of Herod. Herod got killed because what? He didn't say, hey, no, I'm not God. Remember the story?
Yeah, that's right.
They were saying, he's a God. And God killed him. Well, the church is letting them be God, and we're bowing down to them as if they're God, and not objective, not crying out, not even looking for solutions. And we think we're going to escape chastisement and discipline and correction.
Well, and you know what, David, the other thing is, it was, who was it we were talking with last time on Kant? Price.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up Kant.
Yeah, were you?
Yeah.
We always think that ideas are consequences, but consequences have ideas have consequences, but the consequences themselves are the ideas. These laws in themselves are the judgment, because the world doesn't work that way. No matter how you try and fit it together that way, it doesn't work that way. And you can try and work the world that way, and all it will do is curse you, right?
That's right.
And so there's a natural form of God's judgment that when things become inconsistent with themselves, right, and try to be consistent in God's world, they fall apart.
That's right.
They fall apart.
That's right.
Societies, culture, all of it falls apart. And one thing that I've learned from reading scripture is that this is a great time, because what you're doing, what you're communicating, what we're learning, how we begin to live in God's world with these truths at the forefront. There's this one verse in the Old Testament that sticks out to me all the time. When Egypt was going through judgment, there was light in Goshen.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's what's so important. Like, while we are yelling this from the rooftops, the fact that God has given us this knowledge is not just to be yelled, but to practice it and live in God's world consistent with the way that it's made, so that light will be in Goshen when judgment hits everywhere else, so that we can rebuild the fabrics of society. One of the things that I love about Rushdoony and Gary North and all my theonomical writers that I read, Gary DeMar and a lot of the legal scholars and those guys, Boot, is that they are helping me understand how to live the way the world is really made, so that there can be a light that everybody sees and says, why does it work so well over there with this group of people and this family, and the things are beautiful, and that something inside of me wants to comport to that? What is that?
Yeah.
We don't get there apart from understanding the foundations that you're talking about. This is why common law to me is so important right now.
That's right. There's a beautiful passage consistent with what you just said that I've loved in Deuteronomy. It's chapter 6, I think. Chapter 4, verse 6. He says, "So do them and keep them." Mm-hmm. This is what he's talking about. You go live in this ordered, organic, fitting, beautifully harmonious, created order. You go to do that. For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is wise and understanding people.
Right.
Okay. And what we've lost too, I hate to say, is that Christ is bringing forward even now. He is the first fruits of a new creation, that we are called to be the organic representation of for its fulfillment and consummation. But when we sit down, as I mentioned, with this legal organization and say we support the law because babies can suck their thumbs and feel pain, we have conformed our thinking to the way of the world, and we wonder why we keep losing ground.
That's true.
So in the metaphysics of morals, Kant describes marriage as an agreement between two people for the reciprocal use of one another's sexual organs.
Well, now let's go back to this question of the family. Okay, so I'm gonna peel the onion backwards to what Knox was saying a minute ago, or excuse me, the chocolate was saying a minute ago about children. So before Roe versus Wade, that's 1973, right? Where the woman's autonomy and privacy allows her to decide essentially when she is a mother. There is no given fixity or reality to motherhood is the state of being pregnant. To motherhood is now defined by me as the state in which I decide to keep the baby.
Well, David, just to pause there, she's defining almost now whether she's even a woman.
She is, in a sense. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. She's denying a part of her womanness,
Yes.
and we're wondering why. We got confusion in the pool today.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but now here's what's beautiful. Excuse me, grotesquely, sadly beautiful. That was 1973. So the woman is now extracted from the given reality of the man and the baby, right? She gets to decide when she's going to be a mother, and she can kill the baby. 1976, a Missouri case came in front of the court. This was Danforth versus Planned Parenthood, or Planned Parenthood versus Danforth. And the Missouri law said that a husband had a right to participate in the abortion decision. So essentially, a husband could have had a veto, right, over the abortion of the woman by saying, wait a minute, that's my baby too. Well, there's a connectedness here. There's an organic reality. I'm not going to agree to this. Now, most likely, there would never be a disagreement. I mean, I did have one friend who was very pro-life, and he said, my wife wanted to abort our children, and I said, you can do that, but it will affect our relationship forever. I want to be a father. I want to have these children. But in that case, the Supreme Court looked at a decision from 1972, which was the year before Roe. At that point, 1972, the court already knew Roe was coming. Okay? And here's what they said. The right of privacy, the marital couple is not an independent entity. So in other words, marriage is not a real thing with an essential nature that imposes limits and duties upon the persons. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So what we're trying to get back to is this whole question of unity and diversity. That's the struggle that we can't answer in our culture. We don't know how to have unity and diversity. And so is there something that's true about marriage that limits the individuals, or are the individuals the only thing that's true about marriage, and there's nothing that binds them? So the court says it is not an independent entity with a mind and heart of its own, but an association of two individuals, each with a separate intellectual and emotional makeup. If the right of privacy means anything, it is the right of the individual, married or single. Now we're seeing this autonomy really raising its head up, right? This is in 1972. From unwanted government intrusion into matters so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision to whether to bear or beget a child. Now that's 1972. And of course, then in 1992, 20 years later, we see that we're not just separated individuals with an autonomy, but we define the meaning of the universe and everything else. And in 2015, we now define and express our identity.
So
now, Knox, let's go back.
That 72 decision, then, they're saying there is no unity outside of the state. The only
Essentially agreement.
unity
Yeah, and the state.
is
Yeah, that's right.
is
There's no reality to the marital relationship. So in 1976, they held unconstitutional the Missouri law that said a husband could participate in an abortion decision.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, your wife's pregnant. She wants to kill the baby. You just butt out. You see how that from 72 to 73 led to the divorce between man and woman as any organic reality in a marital relationship. Well, of course, that was going to come to full flower in Obergefell. And it did. But it went beyond just we've broken apart the family. We've broken apart what it means to be human as male and female. We've reconstructed the whole person.
So,
and if we don't make an argument, this is where we come back to common law. If we don't reassert the right, the jurisdictional authority of states to operate under common law, then the game is over.
but
And every time I make an argument about the Ninth Amendment and common law, my colleagues and my friends look at me like I'm talking about the earth is flat and the sun rotates around the earth. It just doesn't compute.
but doesn't common law assume layered jurisdictions already?
It would. It would. That's right. So it would assume the family is a jurisdiction, and the state should be very careful about intruding in that jurisdiction.
But if we have already allowed them to basically declare the jurisdiction null and void,
yeah,
how do we move back? How do we undo that? What does it look like even to undo that legally?
Well, this is where, in my view, there really is only one way to do it, absent, some kind of true revolution, and a friend of mine said, I think we're going to have a civil war and a revolution. And I said, it won't matter. As long as whatever the other new nation is still operates on the premise of the human is the defining interpretive principle, we'll wind up in the same place. We'll just get there slower. So that's why I said, whether it's a donkey or an elephant, it doesn't matter. The interpretive principle for reality is the subjective human experience for both parties. So anyway, let me kind of so I want to finish and then I want to come back. Do we have time? I don't know how long we've been talking.
Go. We got time.
Okay. I want to come back to what Shannon just said about how do we get back.
You mean Jason?
But I want to
me or Jason?
Jason. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
I don't know why I keep thinking you were Shannon, but
okay. He's like my brother.
Anyway,
they're hard to tell apart.
I'm just living my own truth here, right?
Hey,
everybody's Shannon.
If you start taking your clothes off, then we're
done. Yeah. See, Shannon can be a girl's name. It can be a boy's name. So I'm just going to call everybody Shannon, and y'all just have to live within my truth.
Well, you got to ask
now.
How they identify.
Okay. within my lawful realm. Okay. Actually, it's your lawful realm because you can say, well, the show's over, hit the podcast end button, and, well.
I was going to let you be surprised when I did it.
Hey, I'm still talking. David, we stopped the show 3 hours ago. Oh, okay. When I don't see you guys, I'm shutting up. But now here's a great point, and it shows how lost we are. I did not see this until about 2 weeks ago when I was sent this article. There's a case that the homeschool community loves and champions and holds up. Here's our authority for homeschooling. It's called Pierce versus Society of Sisters. It's a 1925 decision. It was a unanimous court. And what had happened in that case, I believe it was the state of Oregon maybe, had said, we're getting too many Catholics over here starting their little sectarian schools, so we're going to mandate public education for everybody. And of course, 1925, the schools had a general overlay of Christian moral values and so on and so forth. So not too many people would complain, and the legislature passed the law. Well, the Society of Sisters and the Catholic Church and several other Catholic organizations challenged that law. Said, no, you're violating my parental rights to the nurture, education, training, and raising of my children. Okay. Now, here is what actually happened. I read the case in law school, but hadn't thought about it since then, other than just the moniker, this is parental rights case. Well, actually, here's what happened. I'm going to read you from a law review article. It says, the Pierce Court, even though the arguments were all made by the sisters based on natural law, which the Catholic Church is big in, and the organic nature of the family, biological kinship relations give me certain rights. They arise out of the very nature of this organic unity. They said, but the court consciously repudiated that as the basis for parental rights. And when you read it, the language you and I would be looking for isn't there. Now, again, I hadn't read it since 1981 when I was in first year law school. And then the author says, why did the court do so? Why did they ignore this natural law concept that, of course, you have a certain right? It's inherent in the very nature of procreating. It says an immediate motive, no doubt, was to obtain the concurrence of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had dissented with Meyer and Justice Sutherland in a previous case. Holmes was a prominent and harsh critic of natural law jurisprudence. Holmes would have been reluctant to join an opinion endorsing natural law. Pierce's omission of any reference to nature represented more than a pro hoc vici silence, adopted merely to accommodate Holmes' idiosyncratic distaste. Rather, in the years before and after Pierce, the whole court demonstrated an increasing and conspicuous hostility toward natural law theory, and that culminated in Erie Railroad versus Tompkins in 1938, the case I mentioned in chapter 4 of my book, where the court says the whole concept here, it is a false assumption. Those were their words. It is a false assumption that there is any transcendence to the law. You remember that quote in my book?
Yeah.
Well, that was
so. If there is
Oliver Wendell.
Pardon me.
It was
Oliver Wendell Holmes.
He was idiosyncratic in his day on the court, but he wasn't idiosyncratic in his day philosophically. That was the way everything was going.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's the effect of Darwin. Everything can be explained naturally. There is no transcendent. There is no God. It's all a matter of material stuff evolving and changing and so on and so forth. So here's what had to happen, and I'll say this again in chapter 4 of the book. The common law existed. We couldn't get rid of the notion there's common law. I mean, that was the ground by which we asserted our rights against England, that we had certain common law rights as Englishmen. And so common law, it would be to have said, so therefore there is no such thing as common law, would have been outrageous, even in 1938, because we operated on the basis of common law all the time, which we haven't really talked about what common law is, but essentially common law is an understanding of law that's rooted in our customs that go back so far that nobody can remember when did men not marry women.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. We didn't have to really ground it in revelation, but the common law lawyer would have said, but what we observe is substantiated by revelation. And so the scripture provides an auxiliary guide to what we observe in nature and in our understanding of the works of God. As we look at the works of God, we deduce there's this relationship called marriage and parent and family. And yes, scripture, confirms that. We got that one right. Okay.
Yeah.
So what was going to happen to the common law? You still had to have it. So the court slipped this in. It says the common law exists by the authority of the state. and the only authority is the state.
So rather than the common
Those-
law being the limitations on the state.
That's right. And being and recognizing a fixity to our freedom.
Yeah.
And a fixity to what our human nature is.
Which is
it's just the state.
So David, this is why no one knows what to do with the Ninth Amendment, because
that's right.
They have no idea what laws the state doesn't have. Right?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Right.
And we're so this concept of common law is so foreign to us that we don't know how to understand it. I mean, we may have heard the word,
yeah,
but it's sort of like if you said in the church, what is the concept of the infinitude of God relative to presence? I'd be like, I don't know.
Right.
So you ever heard the word omnipresent? Oh, yeah, I guess I have.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, these are words that have no real meaning. We don't know where to hang our hat on them. We don't know what their content is. And so when I start talking about the common law, it's kind of like, I don't get why that's important. But now here's what's a little sad to me, and I'm trying to be patient. But the whole concept of the Ninth Amendment is, as I said in the book, there's just one page on there. I mean, I wrote a whole book on the Ninth Amendment, but in the Naked Court, it's a page and a half. And I said, the Ninth Amendment talks about the enumeration of rights shall not be construed to deny others. Well, you can't enumerate what doesn't already exist and that exists. I can't enumerate things that I have no knowledge of. So in other words, the Ninth Amendment is a declaration that there is a source of rights antecedent to any written law of man. Why Christians would not see the value and the importance of that when that is exactly what we believe in the doctrine of the creation is beyond me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that goes back to the very top of the conversation, because doctrines of Trinity and creation are irrelevant. The first two chapters of Genesis are just what you have to read to get the cast of characters to appreciate, now we're going to get into this salvation.
This is when I go back and I read Calvin's Institutes.
Yeah,
this really puts everything into a context for me, because I'm getting people now. If people in our day, our greatest theologians in modern day evangelicalism right now, I'll let you figure out who they are. I'm not going to argue with you about those, even though I have those. But the majority of them couldn't write a Calvin's Institute.
Right.
They could probably write part of the first half and would not be able to finish the second half. Where you got Calvin,
and the fourth part about government, they would say that's not even relevant. That's secular.
That's exactly right. They wouldn't have any, which bothers me, because I'm wondering what kind of theology do they have in the beginning that doesn't apply to the legal aspect of it. But that was written in total. Calvin is espousing the implications of the realities of the first half and the second half.
That's right.
And so we've completely left that second half. We couldn't even, right now, this is why I think the church is having such a problem with critical race theory and racial issues, is that they don't have any legal theological categories or see. I think we were talking about this, that the reason most people can only tolerate 30 to 45 minute sermons on justification is because they can't see justification in every part of reality, right? They can only see it in soteriology, but they can't see it in God's creation, the beauty of it. And like you were talking about the unity and diversity.
Right.
They can't see it in the world. They only see it in a salvific type of way, instead of the full legal way and the way that it should apply across the board to everything in life. And so they can only this small sentence. So everybody's bored because you can only preach on that for so much, right? We get it. We really do get it. But they can't extrapolate it past that. So David, help me with this, because I wrote down a few things.
Okay.
I think we did a show last week on common law, and Jason took us through kind of, Alfred the Great and the creation of common law and how he did that with the three. You had Roman law, you had Deuteronomic law, and you had, what was the third one?
The civic law of the three kingdoms that he was now the king of.
Yeah. And just kind of started us there. And then how that morphed and developed over time into what we get in common law. So we kind of have a concept of how that comes into being. But one of the things that I'm understanding common law the right way, and then understanding the word liberty, I think is a problem, because I think we can understand common law, and then when we think about liberty, we have because listening to you talk about it earlier, we have a modern day understanding of what liberty means. And I think there's maybe two different definitions. One of them is what is meant in what we talk about in law, legal terms.
Right.
And then what is liberty ultimately, biblically? What is a biblically defined form of liberty? And then what do we mean about it in the civil realities?
Yeah. Well, today in law, for example, we think of liberty as autonomy, essentially. I mean, that's what you hear in those court opinions, right? And autonomy is just the Greek word for self-law. So I'm a law unto myself. Okay. There are only three kinds of understandings of reality relative to law: theonomy, God law; heteronomy, some external hierarchical thing imposed on. So the Supreme Court, we live in a heteronomous legal system now. The Supreme Court decides what the lawful realms are, and we can play within those, but they're God. And then the other one is autonomous, where everybody gets to be their own God. Now, nobody likes theonomy today. We rebel against heteronomy, but we can't live within autonomy, because then what happens when my autonomy runs into your autonomy, runs into everybody else's autonomy? But the view of liberty today is escape from law. Law is the condition of liberty. Now, how do we understand that? And again, I'll repair to my good friend Jeff Schaefer. I think he was reading from something the other day, but it was so beautiful. And he talks about, we've watched a violinist or a musician, any kind of musician, who's a virtuoso, just really, really good, whether it's, Roy Acuff or Istok Perlman.
RZA.
And vocalists, and their virtuosity, their excellence, the beauty of what they do is made beautiful because they know how to live within the confines of music and the instruments they play. There's certain sounds that wooden things will make that metal things will not make. Longer strings will make that shorter strings will not make. Of lung capacity and different tinges and timbres of voices, and they learn how to operate within that. And where we have problems is the person who hasn't learned those laws, so to speak, and plays badly because they've not mastered and brought themselves fully under those laws and limitations by which beauty can come forth. And that's what God is saying.
I think there's even one more step too, as you get sort of like Schopenhauer, who created his own musical rules and then said, here, I'm going to make you something beautiful. And everybody listens to it and they're like, what the heck is this? And he's like, well, I made up new music rules. And so instead of inheriting from the past the years of wisdom of musical rules,
common law,
right? Yeah, he made up his own musical rules and said, here's the new system. And it was a whole mathematical system. And then, but nobody wants to listen to it because it's terrible. It's inhuman.
And you can't have a choir doing it either, because autonomy.
But you know what? He was still stuck with 7 notes.
Yeah, no, he took all 12. right? He that was part of his.
Well, I mean, sharps and flats, but see, he was still within a limit.
Right.
I mean, artists only have three colors. Nobody said, I've created the fourth primary color.
Right. Well, so his attempts all failed, but he wasn't trying to. He wasn't just bad at what he did. He was great at a false system. Right. He was great at rules that he made up that didn't match up with reality. And I mean,
sure, and you can still see that today on American Idol if you watch some of the contestants.
But it's interesting. I was just talking with somebody recently, a young music student, and they were saying, I'm studying music and all this, and he says, and we're learning how to write in different systems, and he said, and one of the things we're trying to learn is that we're not confined to the 16 beat or the 12 beat turnaround that all the music works in, right? And I said, well, you know where that comes from? And he's like, well, no, I thought it's just made up. It's like, no, it's because music used to be so people could dance. And so you had a 16 beat turnaround, or you had a 12 beat turnaround, so that there were dances that people could enter in and actually enjoy your music. And it was of use to people, so they could dance together, so that then they could connect with one another, so that then they could get married and have babies, and all the things. Right, baby making music has 16 beat turnarounds for a reason.
He went there.
Christians don't write baby makers anymore. I wish we did, but there's 16 beat turnarounds, 12 beat turnarounds are there so that you're serving people in a particular way. There's a common understanding. There's a common culture that we share that says, I'm a musician. I provide music for you to dance to. Somebody else made up the dance, but they know that there's going to be 16 beats to the turnaround, or 12 beats to the turnaround. Or if you play Latin music, that you've got the clave that is going to guide the dance steps of the person leading it, so that they can then guide the woman in the dance. Right. So all of that it's a common culture that we pass down from generation to generation, that in the early 20th century, we tried to get rid of all of it. Right? We tried to separate ourselves. So it wasn't just law. We were separating ourselves from the musical heritage, from the dance heritage. I mean,
well, it had a domino effect.
It really did.
When you start becoming autonomous to law, then you have to recreate a whole new world to follow this new pattern that doesn't go with the flow of the world. Right.
That's right. And that's where we're coming. And actually, I heard something very interesting the other day. Somebody was quoting another paper, but the command about honoring your father and your mother, it was an interesting take. I need to think about a bit more. But part of what we see in Scripture is the communication of beliefs and traditions and understandings through the family. And it is its own jurisdictional sort of authority. So, Knox, going back to what you were saying with the concepts of Obergefell and the ones that led to it, there is no such thing really as a family anymore, except by creation of the state, and it gives meaning and approves certain kinds of social pairings. But we begin to lose the ability to pass heritage, tradition, things down, because that's the way God does it. Now, I'm going to give you another terrible, frightening example. But the legal organization I referred to the other day, a moment ago, that said, we support the Mississippi law because we know babies can suck thumbs and so on and so forth. I've tried to bring about this understanding of the importance of the Ninth Amendment and returning, at least in the states, to common law, because the Supreme Court has left that up to us. The common law. We can decide what our common law is. And if we want to have a statist common law, I guess we can do that. And what I'm trying to argue in Tennessee is, no, we don't have a statist common law. According to our marriage statute and constitution, marriage is the historical institution in legal contract. solemnizing the relationship between one man and one woman. It's rooted in a historical understanding of reality, and I'm trying to return that to Tennessee. I'm not having much luck, and people don't want to take time to listen to it and think through it, and our current processes today don't lend themselves to thinking deeply or long. That's why I appreciated your show and was glad to be on it. I mean, we may have 3 people watch it, but those 3 people will learn something that they wouldn't learn in 20 minutes. But I'm trying to restore that. And so I said, if we don't uproot Obergefell and this understanding of what it means to be human that is now in our law, then parental rights will have to go away as you and I would understand them. If the marital relationship now exists as a matter of convention and a permitting process, and there is no reality to it outside that permitting process, then that will also have to be true of the parent-child relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to have to be true because Susie and Sally, I just saw the other day, Candace Parker, big celebrity at UT, basketball player, she and her wife just had a baby. Well, no, they didn't. They somewhere had a man involved in that process. So how will 2 women ever have the same kind of relationship to their child as me and my wife?
Right.
They cannot. So how are you going to make those 2 equal? Because here I am, natural kinship, biological ties, and they're down here. Okay, can you see my hands?
Mm-hmm.
The only way for these to ever be equal is to move me down here.
That's right.
Because I can never move both of them up here. I said, so we have to do this. His answer was no. The specific answer was, I will give gays same-sex marriage in order to preserve parental rights and the concepts of law that have protected parental rights. Now, I would say, okay, I get that. If, in fact, the created order that God established allows you to break it into bits and pieces and you can lose this piece and not lose this piece, that's fine. But if your theology doesn't extend to a creation as an organic whole where all the pieces have to fit together, if you've lost your doctrine of creation and you've skipped just to Genesis 3:15, okay, that's fine. But the case that they want to rely on is Pierce versus Society of Sisters. I know that. That's the big case. And I just explained to you that it was not rooted in what he thinks it ought to be rooted in, but was rooted in care and custody. That's what the Supreme Court said. It ignored the question of why do people have care and custody or who should have care and custody, but you have rights because you have care and custody. That was what was able to get Oliver Wendell Holmes, who didn't believe in any God-given realities and fictitiveness and organic wholes. That's what got him and Justice Sutherland to join the opinion. 1938, they abolished the whole concept. And we've been free-floating ever since then. This lawyer who leads this organization is living in an unreal world. And he's living in an unreal jurisprudence that thinks I'm going to maintain some right independent of the state, and that cannot exist in the world in which we're now operating. It cannot exist.
I wonder how...
Just crazy sauce to me, but anyway.
It is, and I mean, we have, as Christians, we would say we have care and custody because we have rights, not we have rights because we have care and custody.
Right.
Right.
That's right. It's backwards.
But I wonder with, when you mentioned there's a marriage between 2 women and then a marriage between a man and a woman that legally one has to be brought down to the other because you can't bring the other one up. I wonder though how how many Christian marriages are already functioning basically the way gay marriages function, that they've lost the enchanted understanding of marriage as part of an entire
System
metaphysical
or organ.
cosmological whole,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so that we've already dropped ourselves down to Kant's definition of two people in an agreement to share one another's sexual organs, and have lost the understanding that marriage is actually a window through which we see something
It's more than
cosmologically.
ourselves. It's
This is
more
what
than
we talk,
ourselves.
yeah, this is what we talked about with Dante. When Dante realizes and comes to that moment where he sees a woman and he's like, "Oh my goodness, what do I have to do to get that?"
Right.
And
then understands that actually it's God calling him up to virtues.
Right.
Yeah.
In order to, that right there is an example of the beauty of what it looks like to have a relationship with me in some way, right? A small taste of it. And so he becomes virtuous to be able to have that. What do I have to do?
What do I have to do? When I think and I think we talk about marriage in a way very often that you could replace. You could, in the church, in a way that could be replaced, right? We don't have a theology of marriage that is that digs into those first two chapters of Genesis. We don't have a theology of marriage that comes out of the end of the book of Revelation, right? We don't have a theology of marriage that comes out of that anyway. So in a lot of ways, God is just giving us what we've been doing anyway.
Well, and
that's right. And that's that quote, though. Now that you're mentioning the 1972 quote, that's Kant. I had never thought about it like that. You're just two people who basically are sharing expenses and bodies, but there's no reality to this thing.
That's like what does Doug talk about with we're just two cans of soda pop.
Oh yeah,
just fizzing,
shaking up and pointing
and just fizzing. Okay, David, I'm going to try this again because we get here and there's so much stuff that we have to glean that we get pieces of it and then we keep going. So I think people have to listen like 3 or 4 times to get it. And it might be 10 people, but I with 10 people who want to change the world, we'll change the world, baby.
That's right. 12 is a good number. 12 is a good number.
12 is good. 12 is good. So we have our Liberty West Coast tour that we're going to be doing. And so this is partially is a selfish thing for me to ask you about liberty, because I want to take this on this tour and I really want to pound this in there. What is liberty? Because I think we have the Gnostic autonomous understanding of liberty too. Like I said earlier, we're fighting critical race theory with critical theory. Just as long as we have the power over it, we're fine. But we don't fight autonomy with autonomy, right? That's not how we want to fight. We're not going to win like that. So try again and explain for me a real clear definition of liberty that I can take on the road with me and really preach on that. Because I think I'm not so much concerned about the left right now and their understanding of liberty, or even people who are inside of positions of power, because the way that God works, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then will I hear from heaven and heal their land. So I'm really concerned about the people of God being able to be rooted in his word and his understandings of liberty, so that when we begin to live that way, it has a sonic boom effect to everything else. So really break down liberty for me so that we can have this rooted in how we live and act, and that we're not just bouncing around acting autonomously ourselves.
Well, I'm going to just talk out loud here, because the way you phrased the question is a little different from how I'm used to it being asked. Because we often talk in terms of civil liberty, which is, Blackstone described it as that residuum of natural liberty that exists in society. So if I was truly the autonomous man living, on an island all by myself, there would be, you and I would say, an abundance of natural liberty. Now, we will still be stuck with the need for shelter and food and hydration.
Yeah.
Because we're created beings, but we would have liberty to go any part of the island we want, climb any tree we want, climb any rock we want, swim anytime we want. We'd have all that. But now all of a sudden you stick, 1,000 people on that island. Well, that changes the dynamic, and that's where civil liberty would be understood as that residuum of natural liberty, which we want to preserve to the greatest extent possible, within the confines of 1,000 people living on the island now. Does that make sense? And that's how I normally think of it, is that I can't just climb any tree anytime I want to, because so-and-so's climbing the tree, and we may have to have a rule about signing up and getting in line to climb the tree, and you ought not break the line then once you're in the line. Okay. And so we start developing these rules, and I can still climb a tree, but my liberty circumscribed, my natural liberty, there's a residuum of it that's left. Okay.
This is
But
because
you've asked,
loving your neighbor. This is where we get loving your neighbor. How do I live in relationship to my neighbor that is in a loving way in a civil environment?
That's right. So there is that concept. But I'd like to suggest to you, if when you're talking about preaching it and talking to Christians, and I'll appreciate your feedback on this, because I'm struggling, because again, I'm out of the mainstream. But I'm out of the mainstream talking about the Ninth Amendment and created order and common law. But there's a lot of talk today about religious liberty, right? Typically, that is understood as my ability under the law in civil society to not bake a cake for a gay wedding, or not be forced to sit through some diversity training through my employer. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that we look at this concept of religious liberty. But I would like to suggest that the original concept of religious liberty that began to be expounded by what was his name? He wrote The Golden Chain, and he taught at Oxford. Anyway, his name will come to my mind at some point. But the concept really, and going back to Hebrews and some of what Paul wrote, was liberty of conscience, not liberty of conduct. So, for example, you had Paul and Silas in prison, and they're singing and praising and thanking God. They had no physical or civil liberty, but they had a great deal of liberty in terms of their conscience before God. Now we've lost that concept, and we've equated religious liberty with conduct or behavior. And so here's sort of my question. I'm just throwing this out here. Is that because Christianity itself has become moralistic and synergistic, that I have to do certain things in order to be Christian? In other words, my liberty is not a liberty freed from the wrath of God, where my conscience has been purified, as it talks about in Hebrews. And I can stand before God saying, I still do a lot of really terrible things, but a righteousness has been imputed to me, and the Holy Spirit has been given to me to bring me back to that glorious state and that place of righteousness that was intended for me, and it is apart from the law. So, I'm not saying I should bake the cake, but what I don't want to have to do is to have to pay a fine or go to prison for it. Well, the law, in a sense, hasn't bound my conscience. It's bound my conduct. My conscience is still free to say, I can't, before God, make this cake or arrange these flowers. And so John Bunyan writes Pilgrim Progress where? In prison. We've lost, I think, the first notion of what really Christian liberty is. And so what would happen? What would be the witness to the world if we said, I'm sorry, I see what the law says. It says that if I don't make this flower arrangement or bake this cake or sit through this diversity training, I'll be fined or I'll lose my job. And that's okay. Because coming to know God, the power of God, the power of his resurrection, coming to have a clean conscience before God is more valuable to me, and the prospects of the eternal glory of God is worth any light momentary affliction. And in fact, what you're doing is refining me for what I hope to have later. So go ahead. What would happen if the world said, what do we do to these people now? And they say, I don't know. There's really nothing you can do to me because God works all things together for me. And all of these things, as it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, are for your good, for your benefit. So go ahead. God's
David,
using the wicked for my salvation. Thank you.
It sounds like that, just from that, the way you talked about that, God's doing that whether we like it or not. Right? Like that's what it sounds like is happening.
Yeah, he's refining his people with that exact question.
That's exactly what. And yeah, I think you're right, because watching what happened in 2020 to kind of change it, all of a sudden it took the civil magistrate to press in on whether or not a church could or could not have service, when they could or could not sing, if they could or could not take communion, before the church, at least some of the ones who have been super dispensational and antinomian as it relates to the civil magistrate, all of a sudden they became very, very concerned about what that liberty really looked like you were just talking about.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it was interesting hearing someone who is not theonomic in practice, or not theonomic by name, become very, grammatical, historical theonomic in practice. And because I think they tied together everything you just said. Listen to John MacArthur do that as he talked about whose responsibility. The church is its own government, answers to God. And because we have that liberty, we get to flow and function in this world. It's interesting you bring it up that way. That still is. Go ahead.
So, I was going to say, as best I know, for example, though, John MacArthur is a person who has previously had little discussion about law or politics political matters. And so you ought to say, with all due respect to him, who I appreciate, would you just shut up and sit down? You have capitulated to totalitarian government, and now you don't like it. But why weren't you doing anything about it since 1938?
David, you know what though? This is where you right now are upset, and I get it. Because you're right. I feel the same way on some of the racial issues. All of a sudden, he jumps in.
Yeah.
I'm trying to help bring them in. I'm trying to say, good job, guys. We've been here in the battle for a long time, and y'all start shooting like you did something. Hey, I'm glad you're shooting at the right direction this time. So I get it. That's what I'm saying. I have to be careful. But I don't know any other way to show them, because I've had fights with some of these guys directly on this issue. And these guys are much smarter than me in a lot of ways. But when it comes to this topic, when I feel like I can win a conversation with you, I'm like, this is a problem. I shouldn't be able to hold my ground on this conversation. And the fact that I am means that there is a massive gap here. And I have not been able to convince them how important the understanding and being rooted in Deuteronomic law is until this happened. And now all of a sudden, I see repentance coming. I see an engagement coming. They haven't learned how to pursue yet, but they have learned how to at least where to plant their feet at and what to hold on to. Yeah. So it's encouraging. Because what it tells me is they need more opposition. They don't need more education, right? There isn't any more debates that they need. What they need is a heavy hand of a push against them before they start responding. And they were going to kick into gauge where they're going to be more theonomous than I am, right?
And all I would say is it's not really a they need it, though. It's a we need it.
We need
it. Yeah. I mean, what I'm talking about is stuff I didn't know 4 years ago. I wasn't taught in law school. So really, the response to John MacArthur is, yay, that's great. Now take what you are saying in this context and expand it to all the rest. Don't
Right.
continue to isolate the church as if we exist outside of God's created reality. It was sort of like Luther said, God is sovereign over our salvation, and there's a bondage of the will and all of that. But he said to the princes of Germany, now I don't have any problem with the government now. Okay, this is an inter squad dispute with the church. Calvin came along and said, yeah, Luther is exactly right, but that needs to expanded to everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It became not just soteriological, but cosmological. And so what the real response is, great, MacArthur, I'm glad you have now seen in this area, the government has asserted a jurisdiction it cannot have, that makes it godless, that makes it damnable. But I hate to tell you, the roots of it go much deeper, further back, and spread to all things. Speak to all of it now.
But
don't limit yourself.
This is where Jason is right. We have to, because part of what I think we end up doing is taking the we out of it.
Yeah.
And so it's us and them. And this is what I've learned as being a theonomist is I'm trying to find theonomy in everybody now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I know it's there, because I know they're Christians, and I know that they study their Bibles, and I know they believe God's word. And this is where I think, and I could be ignorant in this or just super optimistic about it, but I think in America right now, the church is in the rhetoric stage. So you got grammar, you got logic, and then you have rhetoric, right? In the classical forms of education. And what happens with the rhetoric stage is you have opposition come against you, and then you learn how to use the grammar, the learning part, and the logic in a way that's winsome to be able to fight, right? And I think right now we are coming to a form of maturity in the churches, the solid biblical churches that are taking a stand, that when they talk, we sound the same. The reason we sound the same is because something has opposed us, and the things that we believe are now being extrapolated to the enemy, right? And that's rhetoric. That's a form of rhetoric. And it's like, man, I found myself agreeing with them 100% in this because of the fact that they have opposition. Before that, if you don't have opposition, you don't really get a chance to use that logic and grammar very well. And you don't develop a form of rhetoric. You can just philosophize all you want to in your head until it comes practical. But when bullets start flying, that training kicks in. And that's what's been encouraging about this and them, is that they have become us as it starts, the bullets start to fly. Because I think that we're getting to that stage now where the church is maturing into a rhetoric form. So if I could summarize what I think you said about liberty, liberty ultimately is a standing that a person has before God.
That's right.
That ties their allegiance to his standard.
That's right.
Because of his grace.
Right. That
they live in a justified manner in relationship to the world.
That's right. That's a great statement. That fair to say? Yeah, get a stenographer and type that up. But yeah, I think that's a great statement.
You said it. I'm just trying to summarize it.
Yeah. And I can be wrong. Obviously, the scripture says you're going to be an aroma of Christ, and to some people it'll be from death to death, and from others to life. But I think what has happened is that the church or Christianity has become so moralistic that we've not really asserted anything other than our moral values. And so you may remember, I don't have a copy of my book, I've given them all away, but I said, if I did not believe in the triune creator God, I would never again assert that any proposition is really true, that it's just my preference.
Right.
And so I have a friend, a lesbian, who finds me very intriguing. she finds me maddening in a way, but has never been really mad at. I think
Yeah.
at times disappointed that I haven't come along, to see her view of things. But the other day I said something about the Bible, and she said, "Well, other people interpret the Bible this way, and others interpret it this way. Everybody has their own interpretation, and so who knows who's right?" And I said, "What you really conceded is that we can't know who's right, and we can't know what's true, and that means you can't either." And I said, "I've loved our time together." And I said, "You've attacked my epistemology, but I said, I've found over the last 3 years, you've never offered your own."
Mm.
Now, what's funny, in my other book I wrote called The Politics of Loving God, this is a true story. When I decided to run for the legislature in 1994, the first thing I ever did was run for the state Senate. So I never worked my way up, but I ran against this 26-year incumbent who was a Republican. And at that point, something came out about gay support groups in the public schools in my district. And so I just made some comment about, I think it's great to have support groups as long as they're supporting them to understand the reality of given realities of male and female and so on and so forth. So I kind of twisted it around a little bit. Well, I got this memo from one of my law partners. I knew he was liberal, but whoa, this was scathing. And I quote chunks from his memo about, "So where did you get the wisdom, and how did you know, and what made you so smart to, all these other things, and how come it is that many gays have created great art and great music and so on and so forth." And so I wrote him a memo back, and I said, "I get it." I said, "But if you'll tell me the basis for your epistemology and how you know that what you know is true, then we can have a conversation." I never got a response from him. Now, I happened to see him a few...
Gays suck their thumbs, so they're human.
Yeah. So, well, I didn't know it, but he had a brother who was gay and had died of AIDS. And so it was a painful thing for him. So he had to say, "My brother's okay and everything's okay." So I have to, but anyway, I saw him in the break room in my law office, not too long after that. And he started to wag his finger at me over something else I'd said in the newspaper. And I had just been elected for like 3 months. And I said, "Hey, wait a minute. I said, I will talk with you as soon as you tell me the basis of your epistemology." And he looked at me and said, "I knew you'd bring that up." And he stormed off and walked off. Now, about 3 years later, I'm going back to visit my friends at the law office, and could have been 5 years later. And I'm in the little break room. We're getting a cup of coffee, talking to some of my friends. And then he walks again, and he starts to wag his finger at me about something else. And I said, whoa. I said, "I'm still waiting from your memo." He said, and I didn't even finish it. He said, "I knew you'd bring that up." And he turned around and walked off. You see, he doesn't know how he knows what he knows is true.
Right.
He just knows he doesn't like what I believe is true. In which case, I'm happy to say, well, that's fine. I have a preference and you have a preference. And so we now decide those things based upon either votes, money, or guns. I can't think of any other alternatives. And in our country, we decide it by votes. And if there are more of me than you, I'm right and you're wrong, by definition. Now, if you don't want to accept those terms of debate, then that's fine. We can have a deeper debate, but you're going to have to explain to me your epistemology. How do you know what you know is true? I've given you mine. I'm waiting to hear yours.
Mm. Were you going to say something, Jason?
No.
Okay. You sound like you were going to jump in. David, here's what I want to do. I got 10 minutes and then I got to run.
Yeah, okay. Good.
But man, we've gone for 2 hours.
Okay.
And I love it. I love every bit of it. This has been very helpful. And I hope, I want you to give people a couple resources that they can grab. We've had you on Cross Politics to talk about your book on the Ninth Amendment. That's absolutely essential to this conversation. The Naked Court. That's another one.
It's short. It's just 60 pages.
It's short. It is, but it's packed though.
Yeah.
It is power packed. And then just real quickly, and like, I'll give you the floor for 10 minutes. I want to help people learn to start operating with this understanding of natural law, because until they can internalize this is not, politics comes from the people. It is an outflowing of the culture, right? Of what's happening in the home, what's happening in the church. And then politics comes out of those too. We don't try and reverse engineer this. We don't get them to do it and then we get it. We have to get it and then it comes from us. Help us be able to take this understanding of common law, internalize it, and start living in such a way that it bleeds through our fingertips and out into the culture and our laws.
Well, in some ways, all we're talking about is what we really already know. I mean, I hate to say it. There's I think Jay Budziszewski wrote a book by titled "Things We Can't Not Know." Now, we would say in our theology that, well, because we're sinful, we will suppress the truth. So the natural man may agree with me to a point, but then he'll say, wait a minute, this point's leading me too close to this concept of God, and this is where I get off the rails. Not going there. And some people will see where that goes sooner than others. So I don't really talk about my theology in the legislation on marriage, for instance, that I filed, or in the legislation I filed about abortion, or on the Rule of Law Life Act, which is in the back of my book, Restoring the Constitution. I've not talked about it in terms of the state's authority to protect me from COVID jabs. What I have done is root it in the common law. One, because it's a term people have heard before, and then I try to explain it. We all know that we have certain rights that don't come from the government. We repel against the notion. That's what's going on with these parents. Wait a minute, I have rights here relative to my children that don't come from the government. And it's infuriating to them to have somebody say, well, no, they're ours now. When you bring them in here, they're ours. We can separate the areas of care and custody. Remember that discussion we've had? So you get certain cares in custody, but the government gets other care in custody. And what the court said in that case, let me just mention this, is that children are not mere creatures of the state. And we like that. But the fact that they said you're not mere creatures means to some extent we are. Okay? So I think what we have to do is pick up on what people intuitively know and feel and press them. That's what Paul was doing. He's saying, you have this unknown God here, but I want to give you something else. So some of you Epicureans have concluded there really is no God, and we live for pleasure based upon what gives the most pleasure with the least pain. Some of you are Stoic, who just believe that there's this God that moves through, almost Hegelian, I guess you could say, is marching through time and so on and so forth. But I'm here to tell you, despite what you have thought about Anaximander and Heraclitus and all of these other people who were trying to figure out what was the true essence of thing and how do we have unity and diversity, we actually live and move and have our being in God. And so we need, as you said at the top of the show, creation is the first revelation of God. And we need to, I think, order our communications in concepts and terms that people can grasp. And then we need to press them and further explicate, press them and explain. So, for example, we could say, I get that you don't like this idea of creation ex nihilo, and you think it's a myth, but I'm not sure how from matter we make sense of the menu. Explain me the menu in terms of pure chemicals and matter. How does it communicate anything? How did matter communicate something? I don't think your worldview answers the questions. Mine, at least, is not contradictory. It may be mysterious that there's a God who is one in essence and three in persons, and there's an only begotten Son. But when you really stop and think about those things, there's nothing contradictory in it. But in yours, there is. And we need to say, actually, these views of reality that you're expressing today have come and gone over centuries. They flourish for a time, and then the roots under them rot and they wither and they go away. But then they come back, and we think we've invented something new, and there's just not. And that's what I'm trying to do with common laws, to say there's something that most lawyers have heard of, most legislators have heard of, maybe not Joe Citizen in the pew, but I can use that term, and then I can help explain that term. I can say to them, did you know in the Constitution there are enumerated rights? Just read the words there. And then I can just challenge them to think, what does it mean to say that rights are enumerated? Are they being created by that document, or simply stating what already exists? Yeah, they're stating what already exists. Great, that's what I believe too. See, parent in Virginia, that's what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
That there are rights that already exist that don't come from the government. But as long as you only argue from a certain perspective, you're arguing into their hands. And they're going to win every time. And that's what we do. The Supreme Court says, I don't want to hear about person. No. I don't want to hear about person. I don't want to hear about person. No, I can't hear you. So what do? We say, okay, well, it can suck its thumb and move around and feel pain. And we wonder why we've been in the wilderness for 48 years. Now, the Supreme Court, I think, will reverse Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But only because they're going to say, well, there's really nothing that's true in the Constitution about anything, and we're just going to return it to the states.
Yeah.
And that's why my friend wants to give up gay marriage in order to protect parental rights, because some states may not protect parental rights. They may have a screwed up version of law. They may have a positivistic view of law. Their common law may be the only authority of the state. So California won't respect parents, but Tennessee might. So he wants to keep a legal theory that created a nationwide parental rights, not realizing that legal theory was not grounded in natural law and truth, but just the mere fact that you have care and custody. And as was said, we believe we have care and custody because we have rights, not that we have rights because we have care and custody. So that lawyer's whole fundamental premise is wrong, and he's leading not only that national organization, but all the groups that I work with down that same primrose path to destruction. And I don't say that in a mean way. I'm just saying we have to wake up, and but that's what we have to do, is start talking about those things, I think. And that's exactly what Paul did on Mars Hill. See, I was taught to believe, Knox, that the story on Mars Hill was simply that Paul reasoned. And he did reason with them, but he did not reason from abstract principles floating in midair.
Right.
And that's where American law is.
Well, that's just where, it's there because and I guess to go back to a more even simplistic form of it, this is something that Jason always talks about. You got to get the story right.
Yeah, that's right.
This is like a t-shirt. And if you start, not a t-shirt, but a dress shirt, if you start buttoning a dress shirt at the bottom the wrong way, when you get up to the top, you're going to be kitty wampus.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Your collar's going to be over here and the other collar's going to be down here, and you're going to be. And so if you don't get the foundation of this thing right, which is back in Genesis, you have to have an anchored understanding of who God is, who man is, and what is that covenant? Because everything we've been talking about is covenant.
Yes.
What is the agreement between God and man, right? How does that look? And then how does that look within relationship with each other? And if you don't have a good foundation and story of what's going on and what God is doing with man and developing the world, then you can't have this conversation no matter how much common law or law you understand. You got to have an anchored root in Genesis.
That's right.
And telling and understanding that story so that you live it in such a way that this is something I've learned too, that as I begin to comport with reality, the way that God has made the world, treat my wife the way that God has made her, treat my kids the way that God has made them, and raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, all of a sudden, some things can just happen and I can just have a natural understanding of how this is supposed to go or not go. Because I'm living consistent with the way that God made the world, that I know that God's world doesn't even function like what are you talking about? It doesn't even function like that. But that's and it's in one sense it's like not that hard, not that complicated when you understand the story. And so I think being rooted there.
That's right.
And then when you get to see like, oh wow, and the story has been going on years before I ever got here.
That's right.
and other guys have been working through this in relationship, like with common law. Then now you say, okay, I have a way to communicate to my peers the realities that they believe are true too, that they might be rejecting.
That's right.
Right.
And
And so,
it does take, I think, from my own experience, some patience. Um, have I got time to give you one example the other day?
yeah, you got 5 minutes.
Okay, this will be a quick example.
Go
So
for it.
in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, it says that Paul's going to Troas and the door's opened, but he's so distraught about Corinthians, he leaves and goes to Macedonia, and he says, but he's always leading us in triumph in Christ, or in his triumph. We're following in his triumphal procession and train. And so 6 years ago, when the Obergefell decision came out, in Tennessee, there was outrage, and that was good. And so the first response of most Christians and Christians in the legislature was, we need to reenact our marriage law, and we need to put some whereas clauses in it that says marriage is a reality and so on and so forth, but we're going to reenact our marriage law. Well, I didn't support that. Now, I didn't support it for correct constitutional reasons, that because our law had never been in front of any federal court, its enforcement had never been enjoined. It was still the law, and the legislature hadn't changed it. And yet they wanted to reenact it as if the Supreme Court had repealed it. Well, the Supreme Court can't repeal a law. They're not the lawmaking body. And they hadn't even said nobody could enforce our law. And I looked at one of the legislators and I said, all you need to do is start impeaching the governor for not upholding the law. You don't need a new law. Well, that went over their head, okay, because they don't understand separation of powers and the limits of the judiciary and all of that. But man, I looked like a heathen because I was not supporting reenacting our law. And I had people come in from other states down here because Tennessee was possibly the place where it looked like it was being whipped up and frenzied. I had people returning to their pastors and their podcasts in Ohio, damning me. I wasn't Christian and I was blah, 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 blah. Of course, they didn't know anything about the law, but that's okay. And it was painful to be publicly castigated by the people that I considered myself part of. So yeah. I'm now proposing a bill. I woke up eventually and said, wait a minute. The fact that you can't get married without the government giving you permission is itself an offense. Obergefell notwithstanding. Who cares? If Obergefell had never happened, we should change our law because government does not own what God created.
Amen.
Especially since the marriage licenses were started to stop interracial marriage.
Yeah, many of them were. But so I go back to visit with this legislator, and I'm telling him about this new bill. And there's a little bit of a hesitancy, and the statement was made. I'm still really kind of disappointed about how things turned out. And, and it just sort of brought up sort of that, yeah, I was the guy that helped defeat your bill because I wouldn't support it. And, of course, there were a number of legislators looking for any excuse to not vote for something that the gay community didn't like. So, I kind of gave them an out, and I get that. But anyway, I go back, and the next morning I'm praying, and I thought, it was as if the Lord reminded me of that verse and said, see, I'm leading you in triumph, David. You didn't take long enough, none of you did, to really understand what all was going on, and that the problem had been in your law all along, regardless of Obergefell. I'm leading you to a better law that frees marriage and men and women to marry without the shackles placed upon them by a totalitarian state. Things turned out better, David, than reenacting a law that reasserts the state owns marriage. Do you see what I'm saying? Right. So what at the time looked to be a defeat, and I'm being castigated, God's saying, no, I got something more glorious to do than that. Something more wonderful to do. Something I want my people to understand beyond just this moralistic view that same-sex marriage is morally wrong. I want my people to see the glory of God and his authority over all of his creation. And I want you to loose what I've made and given to man and woman. I want you to loose it from the shackles of government that says we own it and we permit it. But see, that legislator still can't see that. And part of the reason that we can't see that, I think, in our culture is the same reason I couldn't. I was not brought up with the first 2 chapters of Genesis as being relevant.
Right. Yeah,
and an objective knowledge about who God is and what it means to say he's eternal, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, he's sovereign. I wasn't brought up with any understandings of any of those things, or the decrees of God, or the counsel of God. So I had no place in which to understand and gain perspective that God says, I have planned it, as he says in Isaiah 46:11. I'm just reading it again. I have planned it. Surely I will do it. And I kind of want to say, like, duh, you dolt, wake up, Dave. I planned it. I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Just.
And there was a time when Oliver Wendell Holmes was the minority.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Well,
he won over the long term. So.
Athanasius, come on, guys.
Right.
That's right. There we go. There we go.
Stories. Hey, David, I got to run because I got to go to another thing. But hey, I want to talk to you. I don't know what your time frame is like, but I do want to talk to you about how much time you have in a week to do a podcast. Let that sit.
Okay.
About legal stuff, just think about it, see if you got the time and the energy and all that. I would want a year commitment from you, but I just think it would be interesting to have somebody who is a constant resource. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know that it's out there in a podcast form to go to in a weekly
sort
basis.
Of weekly podcast.
Yeah, I don't know that it exists out there right now that I can think of. And I think even if it's not with us, you should be doing something like this on a weekly basis, because I would be listening every week. And I think a lot of other people would too, because we don't have anybody teaching us those connections that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of people, like, this is why Jason and I are doing this, because I'm realizing where I'm weak as it understands to metaphysics, understanding how reality is being shifted and why we're getting the things that we are getting. But it would be interesting to see this kind of reality in law, the legal realm, and then it can port into how it's playing out right now. I mean, I would have never thought that Obergefell is having something to do with the trans movement and the swimmers. Those connections aren't being made for us in any kind of way. Nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
And so just think about it.
Okay.
And let me know. Let me know what comes to you.
We'll email back and forth. That'll be good. Well, it's been a great blessing to be with you guys, and it really was. Thank you for being willing to take a deep dive in something